For those of you that may not be familiar, Pantheon Rise of the Fallen is an in-development MMO that promises to bring back some of the great good old days of multiplayer MMORPG gaming with the likes of EverQuest, Final Fantasy XI, and those that came before, pulling in that group-focused gameplay, more about understanding your enemy before the battle, and trying to limit the amount of battles you get into at one time, then the modern style of I don't know, rip it and grip it, let's go. What would you even call like combat? It's just full force. Sorry, I lost focus there for a second. But yeah, modern games, it's not really as much about like, you know, necessarily understanding the enemy before you encounter it. It's not about your knowledge of the enemy and your own skills. It's about reactionary, quick thinking and maintaining your rotation. This is trying to bring back that classic gameplay of more understanding tools and utilities that you can bring into a battle so that you can survive, and knowledge of the encounter as much as possible beforehand to, you know, mitigate the risk. It's got a lot of people that were fans of Final Fantasy XI, EverQuest, and obviously those other ones, even the early days of World of Warcraft, very excited, but it's been in development for a long time. 2021, though, was a big year for Pantheon Rise of the Fallen's development, and I think gives a lot of reasons for people to be excited. Let's talk about that a little bit right now, because I think this is something you're going to want to keep your eye on. Let's get into it. So, welcome back. This is Hunt for Games. If it's your first time here, we talk a lot about Final Fantasy XI, my favorite MMO, as well as a lot of nostalgic games from that era, as well as other MMORPGs in general, because who doesn't love a good MMO? If you've been here before, welcome back. If you haven't caught us on stream, we do stream every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, a lot of Final Fantasy XI, but a lot of other stuff too. So definitely stop by and say hi, and bring your thoughts on Pantheon if you've been following its development, because 2021 was incredible. So 2021 opened with the best Pantheon Rise of the Fallen news that we'd heard in a while in terms of its development, with Visionary Realms, the developer, ensuring a significant investment in the area of 7 figures. I mean, these are millions of dollars that were a huge lifeblood to this game. I don't want to say that the development had slowed. They were still making significant progress, putting out updates every month. It wasn't like they'd stagnated, but it was hard to see the path forward. And a lot of their development back in 2020, I believe, was putting towards a package that they could present in front of investors. I think that was 2020. A short like demo experience that they could kind of show what Pantheon Rise of the Fallen is all about in a quick chunk to somebody that might be willing to invest. That obviously is an incredibly difficult ask for something like an MMO. How do you show the scope of an experience, a living in a world experience with other players without other players, without the leveling experience, the minutia, the tiny detail? I don't know. How do you show somebody Final Fantasy XI in an hour and a half and convince them to invest millions of dollars? I don't know. But anyways, that's what they were working on a lot of 2020. I think that was the year. And it was pretty impressive what they put together. We haven't seen all of it, but we saw a lot in some of the streams with Co-Carnage. I guess it worked. Because they did receive investment from an outside investor of 7 figures, which is fantastic and huge for Pantheon's chance of success of actually releasing. Along with that, they announced a lot of updates that they're making to the development lifecycle of Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, which isn't super sexy and like going to draw in a lot of people and say like, oh, I'm keeping my eye on this game now. But it is important for, you know, us following its development to get us more confident in the fact that it actually will deliver, finish, and come out for us in the near future. Those being the HDRP update, and then along with that, in that same video, was the seamless open world update, which doesn't have anything to do with the life cycle, but is important. So the HDRP update was a huge change in how they were crafting zones, creating areas, and it changed the amount of time that was spent for them putting together a zone drastically. So in theory, this will help us actually get to a finalized, finished game a lot quicker, a lot smoother, and it was great to see this coming out from Visionary Realms. They were really excited about these changes. Along with that was the change to a seamless open world, which I wasn't even looking for. Obviously, Final Fantasy XI had zones. EverQuest had zones. It's something I remember and associate with that classic MMO experience of fleeing to a zone line and being safe. But when they announced it, I am excited. So World of Warcraft was the first MMO that I'd ever seen that had that open world experience, and I was always jealous. It was hard to argue with that as a Final Fantasy XI player when people would say, well, like, you've got zone lines, and I was like, no, shut up, because it is awesome. Being able to continuously look out over the horizon, see other zones, see future mountaintops that you can get to that are outside of your current area. And in discussion with that, a lot of things that remind me that these developers, they're looking at the right things. So the biggest fears of something like an open world design, and I think we had a video on this specifically, so I won't sit on this topic for a long time, but the biggest fear with that would be, okay, are you going to have weird mobs that will chase you for 20 feet and then you go outside of their little scope of safety and then you're fine because there's no zone lines? Like Final Fantasy XI, you could run forever within the zone and they would keep chasing you. Same thing with EverQuest, I believe. So there was something to be said for that fear of like, you can't get away. If you get caught, you have to be able to defeat them. And with World of Warcraft, and I keep bringing up World of Warcraft as a game that had open world design. There are others, obviously, but you kind of tend to find the safe distance, and as soon as you run out of that area, they just kind of give up for whatever reason. And it's always a little bit jarring. It adds this feeling of safety that detracts from the tension of being in the open world. And when questioned about that, developer said, no, we're actually encouraging, there's going to be certain places where, two sections of enemies might overlap in weird and unique ways, and they will chase you for a significant amount of time. So hopefully when we get to see that will bring about the same feeling of tension and stress that the old EverQuest and Final Fantasy XI style brought and we all know and love. But again, this was all kind of like, middling of the year. I kind of forget exactly when they announced this stuff, but good to see. But it wasn't super like, I was like, okay, cool, good development stuff, but I'm not, holding my breath for the release. The November roundtable had some interesting details on lore and story, which it is very important to me. One of the biggest things in Final Fantasy XI that drew me into Final Fantasy XI was the story of the world. Like the gameplay was fantastic, and the exploration, the zones were all beautiful, but none of that really is going to matter unless it all comes together in a meaningful way. And the story of Final Fantasy XI and Vana'diel pulled it together in its cohesive thing that made the world feel alive and somewhere I wanted to spend time in. That was such a huge and critical point. Yes, the gameplay is probably the more important aspect. I mean, games that do story amazing but have like average gameplay, I tend to fall off. Elder Scrolls Online is a great example. I think they do story so flawlessly. Some of the stories in that game, I think, are some of the best stories in gaming. They're all voice acted. They're really interesting. The back and forth between characters is fantastic. But the gameplay, I always think, is just kind of average, so I eventually fall out of interest. But point is, I was excited, but again, I was just kind of like, okay, but the November roundtable has me really pumped. I'm really excited, which I'm sure is why they do it in December, because they did I say November, December? Anyways, it was the December roundtable that I'm pumped about, because they were talking a lot about combat and different elements that surround it. And again, they're asking all the questions, and the developers are giving the kind of answers that, for the most part, I'm just like, yes, these guys, they just get it. So some of the stuff that I wanted to bring to light, and by the way, I'll link in the description below the December roundtable if you want to click through it. It's, as always, like a hour-plus interview, which is amazing that they put these out like once a month. But really awesome stuff. I think you'll really appreciate some of the answers they're giving. But they're really the kind of questions that I think Final Fantasy XI players and obviously EverQuest players will really appreciate. So there was a lot of discussion on how are we going to react to various triggers of different combat elements. Like, is something going to say so-and-so cast Fireball? Yeah, probably in the chat log. But more importantly, they're really making sense where there's going to be visual cues wherever possible so you can see that somebody is casting Fireball. One of the biggest things for Final Fantasy XI was you see little red lines like an ability or weapon skill or some kind of action was taking place. Although it was always like the same red lines. You never knew what it was. But, it's an older game. So hopefully we can react to visual elements that are happening on screen without just always staring at the chat log, which would be a huge, leap from some of the older games. Final Fantasy XIV, for instance, has a lot of visual cues on screen, but they also brought up that sometimes there's an overabundance of stuff, and there's just so much happening you can't even understand what it is anymore. And they're trying to make sure that we don't run into that problem where all you see is explosions and fireballs and lightning and shining energy just flashing around, so to the point where you can't even tell what's going on and react even if you wanted to. A huge portion discussing the importance of imbalance of roles. And we've brought this up plenty of times, where it's part of the magic of games like EverQuest and Final Fantasy XI was that the classes were not perfectly balanced. Nothing about those classes in 11 was their flawless balance throughout the game, every level. Level 33, when Thief gets Viper Bite, it is by far the most damage-hungry job in the game at that point. You can put out 500 Viper Bites with a 350 distortion after it. Nobody else was getting close to those kind of numbers. People could do a lot of numbers, but the fact that you could do that burst of damage in a game like 11 was pretty critical. And then there's this whole period from like 45 to 59 where Thief doesn't really get anything new. Viper Bite was it all the way up until 60 when you got Dancing Edge. So there were periods of incredible strength, incredible weakness, averages, but even outside of combat, certain jobs could do things that others couldn't. And they brought this up, and they were talking about especially the importance of like the support class, which is something that most modern MMOs have gotten away from because it's hard to balance for. You almost can't. And they answered it perfectly. So support class being like a bard, or in this case, I think it's an enchanter, is the one that they were talking about. Because somebody asked, are support classes only going to be CC? Because they talk about in the development of Pantheon this crowd control role, because they focus more on roles than like a class or a job only having one particular role, but being able to slot in abilities that might be blending roles, or more focused on, even if you're a damage dealer, you might have like a couple tank role abilities that you could slot in if you'd like. With support being described as more crowd control, a lot of readers, followers, what do you call fans of Pantheon, have been a little concerned, myself included, that while that's awesome that they're kind of bringing that concept back, that it really truly would only be crowd control, and you would just have a couple skills to root somebody or bind or sleep, those kind of spells and abilities to support the party in various ways. That's not damage dealing, tanking, or healing, but it's not true support. It's just focused on crowd control. And that question was directly asked, and they said, no, I forget who was answering it, but said, I do see this as more of a support role, and the important thing that we have to think about is that in developing a support class, a true support class, they inherently have to be imbalanced. And the way they described it was perfectly, saying that damage dealing, and again, I'll link this so you can listen to the full interview yourself, but damage dealing, if you replace a damage dealer with a support and all they do is buff up the other damage dealer to do the missing amount of damage that they do, that's not an exciting, that's a damage dealer by another name. It's damage being thrown out through proxy, but it's not an exciting change to the dynamic of the party. You've just altered where that damage come from. It's not exciting for the buffer, and it's not exciting for the rest of the party. A true support inherently has to be a little imbalanced, where they can offer more to the party, probably to be even stronger than they would have been with just a damage dealer, which is how we used to see it in games like Final Fantasy XI with the Bard, or now the Geomancer, Corsair. Obviously, those classes brought something to a party that made the party better than if it had just been a standard damage dealer. We saw it a million times over and over again. Everybody wanted a Bard in their party at 75. It was a classic, huge problem because they were so good. But alone, a Bard was kind of frustrating to play. And if you don't have that imbalance where like the support character, when played well, and this was an important thing they discussed in the interview a lot, that there has to be a distinction between a character played well and not. If a Bard or a support character isn't played well, the party shouldn't benefit. And if it is played well, they should benefit more than if they hadn't had that support character along. And that imbalance is important to bringing an interesting dynamic of play that makes both the player of the support class excited and the party excited to have that support class. Because there are going to be struggles that a support class faces outside of parties, especially, that others won't, because they're so focused on support that when they're alone, they're probably going to be fairly weak. And they might have unique tools that are available to only them, but it's still going to be a different type of play style. You have to have that imbalance, and I love the way they answered this question. I thought it was fantastic, and I'm really excited to see what they do with it. Because I miss support. 14 keeps stealing away the little tiny bits of support that it has. There's like little tweaks of support, and frankly, it's not critical. And even games like Guild Wars 2, I remember when that came out, like every class could kind of fulfill every role, and I thought the support was like very, very missing. It's a weird way to say that sentence, but Guild Wars 2 had ways to support other players around you, but everybody would sort of be doing them all the time. So the concept of a support class was sort of missing. I think that sort of changed later on when you had gotten to some of the specific, more difficult content, smaller parties. But anyways, moving on. We're getting away from Pantheon. Next, they were talking about perception and combat. They didn't delve into this too much because the perception system, there's still a lot that they haven't revealed, but they revealed more than this is probably like a sneaky way of getting us more excited, but they were like, we're going to reveal more than we intended here. And I was like, oh, are you? But anyways, they haven't talked about perception all that much, but perception in the kind of classic D&D sense where, your role to see if you notice a trap or you notice that there's writing on a wall that's kind of faded, that kind of stuff. But in combat, there's a question of would it affect your in-combat experience? And they got into a discussion about kind of bringing back the concept of like an archaeologist or a scholar helping a party during a quest. And they referenced The Mummy from the early 2000s or late 90s. I forget when it came out with Brendan Fraser. And I was like, that's amazing. But talking about what's her name, the essentially the main character alongside Brendan Fraser, and her role of just being able to read hieroglyphics, understanding the lore and the history around various artifacts or the areas that they'd been to, and the importance of that character in progressing, the concept of the movie, their quest, and how that might be important to discern disposition or traits of enemies like during battle. So I think kind of driving the concept of perception and maybe your own history knowledge and how it might change, your character's ability to assist in that fight, which I think is awesome. And I'm really excited to see what they do with it. More to come on perception, it sounds like. Really cool that they're bringing that to the forefront and really addressing that kind of question of like, is this just going to be a side thing outside of parties? Or is it going to help in combat? Like, are you as somebody with more perception going to be able to assist in fights, even if it's only the first fight of like trying to understand a dangerous enemy better, which is awesome. And last little thing they kind of mentioned, this isn't the last thing they mentioned, last thing I'll talk about was the trivialization of content. This one's a big one because, and describe what that means. What they're talking about is players that, through gaining of strength in various ways, can blitz run, say, a dungeon or a fight. They have found ways to utterly obliterate content that previously gave people a lot of trouble. I get really frustrated when games don't allow you to do that because for me, it restricts the feeling of growth. How do I feel like I'm gaining in strength and becoming stronger and becoming, the top tier MMO player that I know I can be if every time we go to do content, it's just as hard as it was the first time. I don't feel like I'm getting any stronger. In 11, every time you revisit a notorious monster as a higher level, and all of a sudden it's easier to defeat, and at some point, no longer even a difficulty, or you go back to a dungeon or a quest line, or you're trying to get your artifact hands, and you got to fight the bomb. Darkspark. You got to beat Darkspark. And like, there was a time when I couldn't solo Darkspark at all, and it got to a point on my summoner where Darkspark wasn't even a challenge. And that feeling of like, at one point this was impossible and now it's incredibly easy. I love that feeling, and I hate when games try to force you around it. That's where I struggle with games like Elder Scrolls Online and Guild Wars 2, which I brought up again earlier. Just keep coming up. Because they've designed the game around always scaling to content to keep content interesting. And I like what they're trying to do, and I can appreciate that. But at the same time, you do lose a bit of that, like, I'm getting super strong. Now, they did mention, like, they want you to stay within the rules of the game if they find ways that people are exploiting the game in a way that wasn't intended. I'm thinking like cheating, like you managed to trigger something to have like 18 poison effects and it just drains down, but they're not really supposed to have that many, that kind of stuff. They're going to address that. But if you're utilizing, in the way that they described it, an expanded rule set, complete content as fast as you want, if you continue to expand your character horizontally to have enough tools at your disposal and enough strength from your vertical progression to just destroy something, go ahead. Their point was just don't cheat. But I love that answer. And again, this brings back everything that we've talked about with this December roundtable. It's been a long time since I've listened to them discuss, core concepts of the game and how it's going to feel to play this game. And I'm always reminded every time they do that I love their answers because you you can totally sense that they get it. They're not trying to cheapen the experience. They remember what made games like EverQuest and Final Fantasy XI as popular as they were, and even if they are a little bit outdated in terms of some of the concepts of grind and other elements that get a little rough, conceptually there were elements of those games that are lacking in modern games, and that's what they're striving to deliver with Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. Let me know what your thoughts are on Pantheon. I would love to know if you've been paying attention to their roundtables every month and their other videos. The footage we've had rolling was just some random stuff that they put out in their recent videos. The one actually was their HDRP update on how they can quickly produce more interesting zones through their development lifecycle. But I'm very excited. I still think we're a little bit ways away. I wouldn't expect us to have our hands on this game by the middle of 2022 or anything like that. By the end of 2022, I'm hoping we might be able to see some meaningful alpha, maybe get our hands on it a little bit. But yeah, I think they're on the right track again to really delivering something cool. I would love to hear everybody's thoughts. Are you watching for Pantheon Rise of the Fallen? Is there something else that's got you more excited? And other games that you see on the horizon that you're looking forward to. Guys, appreciate you coming out. Definitely keep a lookout for more videos like this. And then, like I said, join the stream on Tuesday and Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Twitch. If you want to, just chat about it there, that's totally fine. Otherwise, like the video because it does help. It really does. I hate saying that, but it helps so much. It helps like an insane amount. Subscribe if you haven't, because, again, more videos coming every month. Wow. My timetable is decreased every week. Definitely come back. Otherwise, I'll see you guys all in the next one. Peace. Eager for that kind of older school concept where there's an imbalance between classes, and choosing the class in itself is this cool journey of what do I want to be able to do now, mid-levels, end game. Are there things that I want to be able to do that other players can't, or things I want to excel at, or things that I want to be at least okay at?